Okay, if you guys wouldn't mind hopping on the screen share, I'm going to cover a topic that's in your lab 0503, and that topic is React-Toastify. You've probably seen these kinds of messages that'll pop up and disappear on more and more websites, or on some websites. And so the fun word that I don't know exactly where it came from, they call that a toast, where these messages pop up, and there is a dependency that you can use called React-Toastify that'll help us set these up. And so we're going to set these up on the front end of our MERN stack app. And, you know, as I was maybe looking at finding a newer solution for these, this still works. This is fine, having these little toasts pop up. And you do this on a couple of scenarios, right? So if you successfully save a user to the database or update a record in the database, more or less on successful messages, is where we want to use React-Toastify. Also, if your server crashes sometimes, if you get like a random unknown server error, that's when you could consider showing an error message in a toast. Whereas if you're just getting field validation messages, you want to use something like Zod, right? You want to use something like Zod, and you just display like, hey, you forgot a required field, right? Not necessarily using a toast for validation error, front-end validation errors. Okay, so I put the scenarios in the Discord channel, but it's basically for the TLDR. It says use toasts for networking issues, server crashes, or success messages. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to use a toast so that when we edit our user and you navigate to another page, we're just going to give it a little success message. So here is my app, and there's a back end and a front end. If you guys are familiar with this, it's the same app I've been working in. And so this is a front end dependency. So my React app is in the folder Vite project. So the first step, of course, is to install that dependency. And like looking at the documentation, you can pretty well see how to use it. So we install React-Toastify, and then here's the documentation. And what's nice about their docs is they allow you to configure these toasts. You know, where do you want them to be on the page? What kind of message? You know, what colors do you want, kind of deal. And so you can see there's a toast message, a toast object, and then there's different methods, that change the style of it. And so you can kind of see what an error toast looks like, along with what settings were passed in to get it to look like that. And so your message here, wow, so easy, and then what does it look like? So point is, you get the idea. You have to add a container, and this container is where it's at on the page. You can see the container has a position of top center. Changing this position changes where it's at on the page. So by changing the element, right, by changing the toast container component, I should say. You can change certain settings, and then other settings are on the toast object. So play around with the docs and see all the different ways you can configure toast and all the colors and the positions where they can show up on the page. So as we install the dependency, the next thing to do is to bring it in on the app. So I do that here at more or less the root of the application, right? We know that the main TSX is kind of the starting place, but really the first component that we're working with is this app component. So what's nice about bringing it in here is you can always send it down, right? You can send the methods down through props. And so you kind of want to define this at a high level in your app so that you can send it down via props. And so the import statement that I have here up at the top brings in those two things that we just got done looking at on the documentation. We have a toast container. Again, that container is more or less the positioning on the page. And then we have the object, the toast object itself, that you can configure with all the different messages. The next thing to do, once you install the dependency, we can go into the dist folder. We can go into node modules, and if you kind of scroll down, I just want to show you, we scroll down to the React-Toastify here, and then dist, and here's a CSS file, right? So if we're going to use these methods and all the, again, kind of going back to the docs, if we're going to get those colors to show up, we need to import this CSS file. And so that's the next import that I'm going to bring in, is a relative path into that React-Toastify, into the dist folder, and then here's your CSS file, React-Toastify CSS. Now, just to kind of simply get this up and running, remember this is JSX, so you have to have a parent node. And so one trick here is to surround this routes element, because that was our parent node. This routes element was our parent, and now it's not going to be the parent. Right? So we need a parent. So without it adding additional markup that's not necessarily needed, you can just have what's called an empty fragment. And so this is just kind of a React trick to kind of force a singular parent node. And this is where I'm going to put the toast container. And you can kind of see that, again, you can go back to the docs and configure your toast container with these different settings. Maybe the position of bottom right. But let's just close it off, and let me show you the error that I got when I was first coding this. If I do a npm run build at this point, I do think I got an error this morning when I was checking this out. Okay, first off is we're not using the toast method. It required, TypeScript required this morning of me to have an ARIA label. If you guys remember this ARIA label attribute from your HTML days, this is for screen accessibility. This is for accessibility purposes. So just calling this toast container and say, hey, this is my toast container, so that screen readers more or less understand a little bit about this markup. Okay, so I've added the toast container, which is part one, and really, again, all these settings, all these attributes on my toast container are configurable, very easy to change them, very easy to test them. You can make those changes as you need, whether it's draggable, whether you can close it, you can't close it. Okay, so then the next thing to do is to call this toast method, right? And so depending on if it's an error, but basically here is a method called toast, then you got this string, and then you've got this object, right? So this toast followed by a string followed by an object. So the way that I do this is I make a method where you can pass in different strings, so it's configurable by this method, as well as pass in different objects with different settings. And so to kind of take a look at the first method here, this is a method called showError. It takes in a string. It calls the toast method, passes that string, so obviously passing the message into this method called toast. And then the second is your object. In this case, we put a type of error. That's going to get you the red kind of error message and the position of bottom right. So again, you can configure this object and you can configure this container as much as you like. But there's my show error message, and then the show success is very similar. Takes in a string message, the type of success though, and the position is also the bottom right, completely customizable. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use props, and I'm going to send these two methods down into my user editor, right? So here's my user editor, and I'm going to send these down using props. Show error equals show error, and show success equals show success. Now I'm getting this error message because my user editor is not configured to receive these props, right? So if you kind of hover over this, it's like, hey, your user editor is not, you're sending data in, but you're not set up to receive that data. Okay, so let's go into user editor and accept some props. Now, in the TypeScript world, there's a little bit more to do here. The messages are show error and show success. So these are the props that we're receiving. And here, after this colon, this is TypeScript, we get to define that show error accepts a string message and returns void. Same thing with show success. Show success takes in a string message and returns void. And so there we've got these two methods with their method headers, if you will, kind of to define these inputs to this component, right? So that makes that error message go away. And now, if we kind of break this down, this user editor, you could see here when the component is first mounted, we get the user by the user ID. So we hit the back end, get the user by the ID, and we call the set user hook to populate our initial user object. And we also use the set form data hook to set the email name and role, which are string, string, and an array. Set loading to false. Okay, so this is all when the component mounts. That's inside of useEffect. We're not touching that. However, when we click the submit button, here's our handle submit, right? So here's our handle submit. Prevent the default form behavior. Set a saving state to true, set error to null. Here we call the backend axios.patch. We pass in the form data, right? The form data is what we're modifying if we're changing any of the form data. Form data is our updated user, right? So here's where, if this works, we're going to call our toast. And then notice it navigates back to user list. So all I'm going to do is after the patch, I'm going to call my method show success, and it says user updated successfully in the event that it hits line 66. And then show error, that will be on the catch, in the catch block. And so here in the catch block, now set error is different than show error. Remember, set error, this is just our error hook that we're using for form validation. Show error is what we're using for our toast. So we're going to be working with show error. Show error. So I'm going to show error here. I'm going to come back and change this here in a little bit. Okay, the point is I just want to get this toast up and running, right? So I'm going to have to refactor this in a little bit anyways. So let's save and npm run build, and let's see if we got any TypeScript errors. Okay, cd ... npm run dev. Okay, so we're kind of launching the back end, which serves up the front end in the dist folder. Okay, now I'm already logged in as a user, but just to show that off, I'm just logging in with my rankinit.com account. Remember that my nav bar looks at my role, and based on my role, it shows me different links, right? This user, this particular user is an admin, so they kind of see everything. Okay, so here's my user list. Here's my list of users. If I go to edit a user, throw the letter S on there, and then you can kind of see, there we go. We got the working toast in the lower right-hand corner. Okay, so quick and gritty, like how to get React-Toastify up and running. That's a demonstration of it. I also, just for the sake of doing this again, because I showed you guys Zod in like one video. I showed you guys some front-end validation, but as we're doing front-end validation here, I thought it made sense to just do another demonstration of Zod for error messages. You know, just as another review of this front end tool. So that's the second thing that I wanted to do today, is get like, hey, if you just leave one of these blank, right, we should get a little error message to pop up. And so let me close this. I should be able to close this, right? So as a reminder, right, Zod is a front end. It's not only front end, by the way. Right now, we're using Zod for the front end and we're using Joy for the back end because we didn't really start with TypeScript until we got to the front end. You can use Zod on the back end if your back end is also TypeScript, right? So it actually makes the most sense. Like if I could do this over for you guys, I would do Zod on the front end and the back end, and I would just do TypeScript the whole time, right? And you guys can. And I think, Nia, I think you already were kind of refactoring your back end with TypeScript, right? So trying to, yeah. It's a process, right? It's not an easy process, but it's a process.
It's really hard.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So in a perfect world, you have the same schema on the back end and the front end. The same Zod schema for the front end and the back end, but we don't have TypeScript on the back end, so we're stuck with Joy, and we have a different Joy schema than different Zod schema on the front end. So that's kind of the weird world that we're in. Long term, like if this were like a real world production app, I would say, okay, let's get the back end in TypeScript and let's use Zod on the front end and the back end. That's not where we are today. That's the direction we can head. Some of you are already heading that way. No big deal either way. Okay, but let's just kind of remind ourselves on the front end, we've got these different schemas, right? So here's my login schema that requires an email and a password, right? So I've got a login schema and I've got a registration schema. And so here's my new customer registration schema. So I got two schemas so far, and these are the demos of Zod I've done so far. I'm going to do a third one. And this is going to be a user editor schema. So right under the schemas here, new file, user edit schema .ts. And we're going to import Zod, import Z from Zod. Okay, this is the thing about this is, since we've done Joy, it's like you guys were already, not a big learning curve for Zod, right? Because you've done this before on the back end with Joy. So okay, this is an email, which is a string email, and if they don't give me a valid email, we'll say invalid email. A username, which is also a string. We'll say minimum of, I don't really know, at least one character, and say name is required. And an optional role array. Role is a z.array. And we could say, okay, here, these are your valid enums. These are the valid values for our customer. We have a contractor, and we have an admin. These are the three values that we can have, and let's export this. Export user edit schema. Okay, so define the schema. We have a Zod schema. And by the way, this is something we're going to do tomorrow. When it comes to data validation, 3 places to do it. You guys have heard me say this before, but I'm going to repeat it because it's important. three places to do data validation are on the front end. We're doing that with Zod. On the back end, we do that with Joy, and on the database, right? Some databases, like Mongo, are pretty loose when it comes to data validation. Like that's, in some people's perception, that's a benefit of Mongo, is that it's pretty loosey-goosey with the rules, right? Microsoft SQL Server, when traditional normalized databases are very strict with their rules. Okay, so the point is you do data validation in three places. What I'm going to do in the near future, probably either later today or tomorrow, is I'm going to have, this is a front-end validation, I'm going to receive a back-end validation error in the front end and display that, right? Right now we're just going to stick to the front-end validation and we'll show that off, just working with the front end. But I actually want to hit my back-end express routes, and I want Joy to throw a different validation error, and I want to receive that, and I want to display that in the UI, right? So what I'm going to do, just as a forecast, is I'm going to make it optional on my Zod, but I'm going to make that role required in Joy, so that I can get a Joy error message displayed in the UI. Okay, so that's coming up after this. Okay, so there's my user edit schema. Let's go back to my user editor now and bring that in. So back on user editor, let's import. This is a default, so we don't need destructuring. And remember, the @ symbol is configured as our dist folder, right? Not dist, the source folder. The source folder. Were you correcting me?
I was guessing.
No, you're right. Thank you for correcting me. If you were, thank you for doing that. But the @ symbol is, yes, the source. So source, schemas, user edit schema is the name of the file. Okay. Now we're also going to introduce a new hook after set error. I have a new use state hook that I need to show you guys this. Web Dev Simplified YouTuber, you guys know that YouTuber. He shows the proper way to validate objects with TypeScript is actually you want to use a record type, right? So here we have an empty object. We're essentially initializing this to an empty object. But when it comes to TypeScript, you have to say, okay, what is this empty object? And the way that is recommended with TypeScript is to say, hey, this is a record of type string. So think of like, you know, your dictionary, right? Your dictionary has a key value pair. And so this is just a record where you can look up a key and its value. That's what an object is, right? Key value pairs. So that's the data type for this empty object. And that is something that I learned from our friend Web Dev Simplified. Okay. Now, you know, you can get multiple validation error messages, right? I mean, you could leave a username empty and an email empty, right? So that's why it has to be multiple errors, right? This is not just a single error, but instead multiple errors. And so let's go down to our try block and our handle submit. And the first thing that we're going to do in our try block is we are going to Now notice what it's suggesting, right? We're going to take our form data and we're going to validate it against our user edit schema. So user edit schema.parse. So this is the data that we were just sending into our back end. But instead, glad you made it.
Yeah, I kind of tended to like file the paperwork and then leave. That's why I'm not wearing like my clothes.
Got it. So what I'm doing here is I'm running the validation, right? User edit parse. And it's storing the results in validated data, and it's suggesting here to pass validated data into my backend instead, and that is, of course, correct. Now, if there's an error message, right? So if this doesn't work, it'll trigger the catch block. And the catch block is where we're going to basically loop over our error messages. And essentially here, you could think of this as looping over all of our Zod error messages. Now, why is that not working? Because I haven't imported Z from Zod up top. So let's go back to my imports up at the top, and let's import Z from Zod there. That will get okay. So here's this if statement, and I just paste this big old block of code over, right? And so you can look through this just like I can. But high level, what is this doing? It's figuring out if there's one or multiple Zod errors, and it's putting this into an object. That object is called field errors, and then we're setting the validation errors to our field errors object. You can see it's a for each error inside of the issues. So this issues is an array, and we're for eaching over that array. And we're basically getting the message out of it. Okay? So there's our validation errors. Okay. So now we've got the mutator, but now we need to display our validation errors, okay, in the markup. Okay, so let's go down to our actual markup, because this is all the JavaScript up here. And let's go to our input type of email. Okay. Now the one thing that I'm always dealing with is I prefer Zod error messages versus the HTML5. This required attribute is an HTML5 attribute. Okay, I don't want HTML5 error messages because those are ugly, and that's not what I'm going for. I want the pretty red error messages. I don't want HTML5 error messages. You guys know the difference, right? The little pop-ups in the text box itself. So I'm going to remove this required attribute. And after this input tag closes, I'm going to have a little conditional here. Validation errors dot email. Okay, so if validation errors email is truthy, then what do? We say and parentheses. We display that in a paragraph. So if there is an email attribute, we have a little paragraph with text red 500, text small, and we display that error message. So pretty simple error message. if that's truthy, then we do the same thing with full name. So after full name, go down here. Here's our validation errors. So if there's a name, if that's truthy, then we display that. And last but not least, here we're mapping our roles. And after we map our roles, we close a div. So here we're mapping our roles. We close a div. Let me get this in the right spot. Close the div after the mapping of the roles. And then right after that closing div, we say, hey, if there is a role attribute on our validation errors, then display that like such. Okay. So I think that's all that's needed. Of course, I can make a mistake like anybody else. So let me go back to my front end and do a build, npm run build. Go back to my backend, npm run dev. All right, and let's boot that up. Okay, so sign out. Log in with Google, and my admin, and my user list, and let's edit Brody, and let's leave his email blank. Okay, perfect. We got some Zod, Now remember, roles are optional, so I can actually leave those off, and I'm not going to get that to error out, okay? My point is in a next demo, I'm just going to show how I can actually get a joy validation error message from the back end. And regardless if it's Zod or joy that's causing the thing there, I want the UI to display the appropriate error message. So that is the two things I wanted to cover today before you guys get into labs. Okay, you now have seen a demonstration of Zod again, and you've seen React-Toastify, which was one of the lab requirements.
I thought we weren't using Toastify.
You don't have to.
Oh, okay.
You don't have to. In fact, I was looking at something else myself, and I ended up back here. But I do ask for a toast, and so if you want to use a different library or a different way of implementing it, you totally can. Okay. All right.